Life is just far too short to spend your time doing something that you don't enjoy. Welcome back to another episode of the Nomad's Notebook podcast. My name is Joe Maxwell, and today we're talking about passion. I'm going to tell you about a recent trip I took to Europe, a life-changing conversation I had on the Charles Bridge in Prague, my inspiring visit to the birthplace of Mozart, the true meaning of passion, how you can discover what you are meant to do, and much more. One of the most intriguing aspects of travel to me is the random conversations that you have with people who you would have never otherwise met in your regular life. Your paths cross for a brief moment in time, and then they're gone for eternity, just like a drift in the wind. I've crossed paths with many people through my travels in this same way, some of whom I've connected with very deeply, even if it was just for a 15-minute conversation. A few people really stand out to me in this way. I met an Australian guy while I was staying in a hostel in the city of Bern about 18 months ago. I'll call him Jack. Jack was about my age and was one of the few 20-something-year-old guys who has actually lost more hair than I have, so that caught my attention, made me feel a little bit better about myself. It was just the two of us in the hostel for a couple hours one evening, and we got to talking. Jack had worked a few odd jobs, and like me at the time, he had recently broken up with his girlfriend. I got the sense that he was running away from something, but I wasn't exactly sure what it was, and yet I understood the feeling perfectly because deep down I knew that I too was running away. From life, from work, from responsibilities, maybe a little bit of all of it. Perhaps that's why when traveling, I found it so easy to connect with others because in some way, we're all trying to escape the reality of our mundane lives back home. Jack had saved up a substantial amount of money and he planned to travel indefinitely. He figured he'd be gone for at least 6 months and maybe even more than that. We chatted about just about anything, his job back home stocking grocery store shelves, the girls that we had both recently dated, and my parents' sick golden doodle back at home. We made our way down to the hostel lobby, and there just so happened to be this old, scratched up pool table that was sitting in one corner. As it turned out, Jack's father ran a bar until he was about 18 years old, so his billiard skills seemed to approach a near professional level, at least to my very untrained eye. For someone with very little pool experience myself, I was very quickly humbled in some early games, but Jack was a nice guy and he showed me some fundamentals and he had me striking the cue ball pretty consistently just a few rounds in. It became a bit of a routine for us for the next couple days. We would return to the hostel from our own individual adventures that day, head down to the lobby for a round of pool. We didn't actually spend that much time together, maybe 5 or 6 hours in total, I'm not exactly sure, but I felt like we really connected on a deep level, and I think he felt the same too, probably because we were in such a similar place in life at that time. Isn't it so interesting how with certain people we seem to connect so quickly and with such little effort, and yet with other people it can feel like we're on two different planets? Why is that? One morning, it was time for me to leave. I had a train to catch to my next destination, which I don't totally remember where that was. Jack was still asleep, so I took off without saying anything. I had also gotten in the habit on this trip of gathering people's contact information, but Jack and I never did for some reason. I suppose it just slipped both of our minds. I think about Jack often, and with no way to contact him, I can only imagine where he is in life right now. He probably arrived back in Australia some time ago now. I can only hope that he, like me, has started to find his path in the regular world again. More recently, I took a trip to Prague, Vienna, and Budapest. I keep wanting to call them Eastern Europe, and in fact, when everyone at my work was asking me where I was going for vacation, Eastern Europe was always what I said, but technically this area is Central Europe. Some people over there will get kind of mad if you call it Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe is usually reserved for places like Ukraine and Romania. Anyway, one of the highlights of that trip for me was my very first stop in the city of Prague. I found the medieval architecture really set things apart here. There wasn't a hint of westernization over there. And when I travel, I want things to be as different from home as possible, so Prague definitely fit the bill on that front. I also had a few fascinating tour guides who showed me things in that city that I would have never thought to look for on my own. One of the tour guides was named Jasmine. She was originally from Iran, actually. She came to Prague probably 10 years ago for university, and then she never left the city. She loved it there. Her joy and passion for life really stood out to me. She could have certainly done just about anything in the world with the quality of her education, but she chose to be a tour guide very deliberately because she simply enjoys it. I always find it to be a great lesson when I see someone pursuing a career simply out of enjoyment without a thought of money or status. I feel as though so many of us get trapped in a situation that we maybe don't hate, but it also wasn't what we were meant to do in life. Usually this happens because we have a family to support, or maybe we simply lack the courage to set out on a new path. Jasmine and I had some fascinating conversations about history and just life in general between the various monuments and buildings that we were visiting in Prague. Specifically, we talked a lot about World War II and wondered out loud why it is that people can't seem to stop fighting through all of history. Now, that's probably a topic for a later episode. Another thing that makes solo travel so interesting is just the unpredictable nature of it. You never know when you're going to stumble upon an interesting conversation with a stranger. After the tour with Jasmine, I was making my way back to my hostel and hoping to find somewhere nice to eat on the way home. I stopped for a moment on the Charles Bridge, and I was admiring the architecture of the bridge itself. It was built in 1357, and considering this incredible age, it's in really good condition. I was also staring at the backdrop of the Prague Castle. I figured it would be a really good place for a photo, so I very intentionally approached a pretty young lady nearby and asked her to take my picture. She happily agreed, and we quickly got to talking. We skipped the small talk almost immediately and started talking about life. Her name was Naomi, and she was originally from Holland, but her parents were in the process of moving their entire family to a 200-acre farm outside of Budapest. For years, they had craved a more rural-type lifestyle, and with real estate prices in Hungary so much cheaper than other places in Europe, it was a logical place for them to move to. Recently, Naomi had taken the opportunity to explore Europe. She'd been traveling for about a year when I met her, and she had no plans of stopping. She didn't have a consistent job, and she got by sleeping on friends' couches and working odd jobs for a few weeks at a time wherever she was. She really reminded me of a female version of Chris McCandless from Into the Wild. In some way, I really envied her carefree approach to life. A part of me has always wanted to live that kind of lifestyle, but something always keeps me tied down to a safer, less risky existence. And I'm not totally sure what that is. I shared a little bit about my life back home in Ontario, things like my job and my passions outside of work. I actually shared my early vision for this podcast with her, but I also shared how I had reservations about the topic because I thought it might be better to create something in the business or sales space, things that I have experience with and that might create more opportunity down the road. I guess Naomi to be probably 21 years old or so, but she was really wise beyond her years. She helped me understand that life is far too short to work on something that you're not deeply invested in, deeply passionate about, and ultimately, you'll probably be more successful in the long run anyway doing something that interests you on a deep level. No doubt she was right, and her encouragement was the last push that I needed to create the Nomad's Notebook podcast. So this episode is dedicated to Naomi, even though she'll probably never see it. After about 15 minutes or so, we both had other commitments to get to and decided to part ways. She hugged me and said that she would never forget the conversation. I said the same, and we walked off in separate directions without ever thinking to exchange contact information. I'll almost certainly never see Naomi again, but the conversation is something that I'm never going to forget. Isn't that incredible how such small things in life can impact us on such deep levels? Well, I think of her often, and a part of me wonders what would happen if we were to meet again somehow. Deep down, I think it's for the best how things worked out. we parted ways with nothing but a beautiful memory between us. No heartbreak, no conflict, and no ugliness. Just a pure, untainted connection that we will treasure the memory of. The breakfast at the hostel in Prague was one of the best that I've ever seen. You see quite a variety of food quality within these places. Some hostels I've stayed at have nothing better than some stale cereal and a disgusting looking jug of milk, while others will serve a buffet spread that wouldn't be too out of place at a Ritz-Carlton hotel. Now, I had a train to catch out of Prague at 7:46 in the morning. Breakfast didn't open until 7 a.m., but I figured the food was just so good I could spare 10 minutes for a meal and then catch a taxi and head down to catch my train. So I ate breakfast, and the Uber took a whole 15 minutes to show up. Now, it was 7:25, and I was starting to sweat it a little bit, but I knew it was only a 5-minute drive to the station, so that would still give me 16 minutes to find the right platform and get on my train. But I forgot it was rush hour, and that traffic turned it into a 10-minute drive, so the driver let me out at exactly 7:35. And one thing you need to know about European train stations is they are notorious for their horrific layouts, especially for someone who's new to the country and, to be honest, not naturally great with directions. I was trying my best to figure out where to go, but the number of my ticket wasn't matching up with anything I was seeing around the station. And by the time I knew where to go, it was 7:45. And this is a pretty massive train station, right? Prague is a big city. I ran to the platform, I sprinted up the stairs just in time to see my train slowly pulling away. Now, I was a little bummed out, but it wasn't too big a deal. I booked another ticket for another train leaving about an hour later, and it was only $50 or so I didn't really care. No harm done, right? It would still get me to my destination of Vienna within an hour to spare before the start of my World War II walking tour, which probably more than anything else on this trip, I was most excited for, and I couldn't rebook. They didn't have any other time, so I'm still feeling pretty good about things at this time. I explored the station for a while, I headed back up to the platform, and sat on my train. As the second train was pulling out, I glanced at my ticket and happened to notice that, unlike my first ticket, this one wasn't actually heading directly to Vienna. There was a layover in a tiny little town in southern Czechia that I will never remember the name of, and even if I could, I wouldn't be able to pronounce it, so just take my word for it. And that's not all. They very smartly left me an entire 2 minutes to switch between trains. So now I'm stressing big time during this first leg of the trip, right? Because I don't want to miss this walking tour, and I've already been delayed about an hour. I didn't have much room for error here, but luckily we made up time, and we got there about 5 minutes early or so. So I was very comfortable. I located where I needed to go, and I walked onto my second train. On the train, I had a lunch of Austrian pork schnitzel, and everything seemed like it was in order. Then the train stopped, and it was clearly not at a station. Out one window, I saw this rich, deep blue river flowing briskly, and on the other side, I saw some very foreign, weird-looking European cattle who were munching on some hay. Something was wrong. The conductor announced something on the train in a foreign language, which I obviously didn't understand, but from what I gathered, there was some kind of problem on the tracks that would take about 2 hours to resolve before we could continue. And remember, I only had an hour before my tour started. But after about 45 minutes or so, we amazingly start rolling again, and I'm still holding out hope that I can get there in time. We pull into the station at Vienna around 2:15, and the tour started at 2:30, and it was a 10-minute drive to get there. So at this point, I realized there was no way I was going back to the hostel to drop off my suitcase as I had hoped. That was just out of the question, so I ordered an Uber and waited to be picked up. And of course, none of them could find me. So I got ripped off by one of the nearby taxi drivers. I paid him like 40 euros, but I told him I had to make it there in 8 minutes or less. He said, "No problem," and away we went. Now, this man showed some serious James Bond driving skills, just maneuvering around, and he was good to his word for 8 minutes. We pulled up to the tour at exactly 2:29 p.m. with my suitcase in my hand. I dragged that suitcase around Vienna for probably 4 kilometers and got plenty of weird looks, but hey, I did not care at this point. I wasn't going to miss out on this tour. The highlight of that tour for me was our stop at the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts. This place is so significant because it was the school that Hitler applied to 2 times when he was a teenage artist. Both times he was rejected because of lack of skill. That rejection, among other things in his life, I'm sure, led him down a path that we know him so well for. Something I've considered often is how history might have turned out had he been accepted into that school. I even went so far as to ask the tour guide this question. He chuckled for a moment, and then he turned dead serious and told me that we obviously can never answer that question for sure, but things might have turned out even worse. Germany at that time was primed for someone like Hitler to take over because of the way that World War I had ended and the economic effects of the Great Depression. Sooner or later, someone like Hitler probably would have taken advantage of that circumstance. That was a really interesting answer to me. In my mind, I always imagine alternative historical scenarios, something I do a lot, as being better than what actually happened in reality. But human nature is such that someone will always find a way to take advantage of external circumstances and push this narrative of life forward in a similar way. As they say, history always repeats itself. Early on my second day in Vienna, I couldn't sleep. I was stuck with 3 guys who all snored really loudly, so rather than just lie awake in bed, I got dressed and took off around 5 a.m. This actually worked out well because I had a bus to catch to the town of Salzburg not long after 5. Salzburg is a much smaller city than Vienna. There's only about 100,000 people living there, but it's known for incredible historical architecture and scenic natural views. My tour guide's name was Martin, and he was very knowledgeable of the area. In fact, he had lived in Salzburg for a period of time when he was a young adult, before moving back to Vienna where he grew up. Now, I've listened to many different tour guides across my travels from different countries and different walks of life. They've all been incredibly laid back, funny, and outgoing people. That just seems to be part of the job with being a tour guide. The one exception to this rule are the German and the Austrian guides who I've met. In my experience, they're always incredibly dry with little to no humor at all. I guess that's just a cultural difference with German people, but isn't it interesting how you can get a completely different vibe from a whole country of people? But in the case of Germans, at least, I understand it, them being a little dry, not being super funny. They've had a lot in their past that they've had to deal with. Now, there's 2 sides to the city of Salzburg. The old town is located right against the face of a cliff on one side of a river, and then the newer portion of the town is on the other side of that river. While it was a beautiful location, it struck me as really odd at first, but then I thought through things from more of a medieval angle, and it made a lot of sense. The location of the old community is very easy to defend because people wouldn't have very easily been able to attack from a cliff face, and then crossing a river on the other side is also no picnic, especially in the 7th century when Salzburg was formed. So I imagine it would have been a very safe village back in the day. I've been to probably 20 or more cities in Europe, but within 10 minutes of walking around Salzburg, it very quickly became one of my all-time favorites. The 2 reasons for that were the incredible natural scenery that surrounded the community, like that cliff face I mentioned, along with the incredible preservation of historical buildings. Martin took us around the old town for about an hour or so, and as we were walking, I noticed that every single building had a large number on the outside wall close to the top of the building. Numbers like 1256 or 1575 or 1146. And I just assumed that they were street numbers, but I asked Martin about them and he corrected me and said, no, these are actually the dates that the buildings were constructed. I was so shocked to hear that because of the incredible condition that the buildings were in. They looked like they could have been brand new, which is just a testament to the craftsmanship of the architects who restore these buildings on a continual basis. So we walked around as a group for about an hour or so, and we stopped in front of this big yellow building, which Martin told us was the birthplace of Mozart. His family rented an apartment on the 3rd floor of this building before moving to a bigger house in another part of Salzburg, which coincidentally we had actually seen earlier. Once the guided portion of the tour was complete, we had a few hours of free time around Salzburg before we had to head back to Vienna. So I checked out some old churches that looked interesting, and then I headed back to the Mozart building, which they have recently converted to a museum. They had a number of artifacts on display there, including the piano that Mozart learned to play on when he was a child, and he actually would have this piano carted around to his various shows in different parts of Europe because, understandably, he was extremely particular about only using this piano for concerts. There was a lot of interesting things inside that museum, but one item in particular really caught my attention. Behind a glass case in one corner was a letter handwritten by Mozart himself and addressed to his sister. The letter itself was in Old German, obviously, because that's what Mozart spoke, but there was a translation in English underneath. In this letter, he was basically telling his sister about what his daily routine looked like. I'm summarizing here, but it essentially was something like, wake up at 5 and immediately begin writing music until 9 a.m. Then he would teach music lessons from 9 until about 1 p.m. or so. Then in the early afternoon, he would prep for a concert, which he had multiple times per week. Then he would perform until about 9, get home at 10, and he said that most days he would resume his morning writing until about 1 or 2 in the morning. He would then go to sleep and do it all over again, day after day after day. What I found so interesting about this was the fact that it provided a little look into how Mozart got to be who he was. I find that history often tells us a lot about famous people and what they accomplished when they were at this mountain peak of their lives, but we rarely hear about the rise to get to that peak. There's a movie about Mozart that came out in the 80s called Amadeus. You've probably seen it. It's honestly a pretty good movie and I really like it. But the one thing I didn't like about it was how they portrayed Mozart as kind of having this nonchalant, silly, undisciplined attitude towards his music. And I don't think this was accurate. Artifacts like the letter to his sister paint a picture of him as a diligent and disciplined student of music. As the letter showed, he was so dedicated to his writing that he would only sleep 3 or 4 hours a night so he could write more music. Some would say his insane level of dedication actually contributed to his early death at, I think it was 35 or 36 years old. So why did he push himself so hard? Was he forcing himself to do this? I doubt it, to be honest. Mozart had a deep love of music, and this drove his persistent dedication to his craft. He also had an environment growing up that really nurtured his natural ability and interest. His father, as a career, was a music teacher for children, so he definitely set him up with the correct fundamentals. Whenever a natural interest towards some pursuit is met with discipline and a nurturing environment, that's when we seem to see these incredible outliers. Tiger Woods is another great example of this. There's a video of him on YouTube, him putting on live TV when he was like 2 years old, so he clearly had incredible natural interest and ability. His father was also a solid golfer in his own right, and he ensured that Tiger had a complete understanding of the fundamentals of the game very early on, and this ultimately led Tiger to becoming one of the best golfers of all time. HBO came out with a documentary called Tiger a few years back, which I really enjoyed, and that gave us an inside look into Tiger's upbringing, specifically the relationship between him and his father. And to make a very long story short, it's pretty clear that his father did push him far too hard and kind of ruin that relationship. But that's another conversation for another episode. My takeaway from that trip to the Mozart Museum was a renewed appreciation for the importance, how essential passion is in life. To become exceptional at something, you have to practice it for years and years on a consistent basis. You have to become obsessed with that one thing as you move towards a set goal that you've defined as clearly as you possibly can. We use this word passion a lot, but what does it actually mean? Have you ever thought about that? If you look up the dictionary definition of passion, you'll probably read something like an intense feeling of excitement and enthusiasm. But if you dig a little deeper, you'll find that the word passion is derived from the Latin word passio, and passio means to suffer. In Latin translations of the New Testament, that same word passio was used to describe what Jesus experienced when he was hanging from the cross. Jesus was willing to endure this incredible pain and to suffer because of his intense love for humanity. So that's what true passion means to me. It's a willingness to suffer through pain because of an intense love. Passion in this sense is, I believe, a huge contributing factor to a very satisfying life. So how do we find what we're passionate about? Well, first thing, there's a common misconception that out there somewhere in the world is this pursuit that you were meant to do, and once you find it, bam, you're passionate about it. But that's not how it actually works, at least not in my experience. In reality, you maybe find something that you naturally gravitate towards a little bit. It seems to suit you well. And then over time, you invest more and more into that pursuit and gradually get more proficient at it. And as that happens, passion starts to develop slowly. Over the years, when our enthusiasm naturally ebbs and flows, it's never consistent. Passion is the glue that keeps you going even when things get very difficult. A feeling like enthusiasm or something similar is just far too unpredictable to base major life decisions around. You can compare passion to a romantic relationship. If you go on a date with someone, you may feel a natural pull towards them and you probably hit it off, your personalities are jiving well, but you're not going to be deeply in love with them immediately, or at least you probably shouldn't be because you're going to push them away. But over time, as the two of you invest in each other and share life experiences, passion or love begins to develop. So if finding what you're passionate about isn't the right question, a better question might be, how do you find something that you naturally gravitate towards? Let's start there. How do you do that? Well, I have a few ideas for you. Like with most things, you need to start with broad vision. You don't have to get super specific at this point, but ask yourself a question. What do I want my life to look like in the future? I struggled with this question for years, but the word that I kept coming back to was freedom. I wanted location freedom, time freedom, and money freedom. That very broad concept has guided a lot of my decisions as far as my pursuits in life goes. So once you have a rough idea outlined of where you need to go, I need you to try something else. I want you to sit down in a quiet room where you won't be disturbed with a pen and paper and write down a list of all the things that you're interested in. It doesn't have to be career or money related at this point. Just brain dump everything that comes to your mind. I'm naturally a creative person who likes philosophy, history, traveling, and self-improvement. Since I want freedom, like I mentioned, that led me down a path of starting my own venture, and ultimately podcasting and content creation is a pathway for me to exercise my creativity, explore the interests that I mentioned, and hopefully help some other people along the way. That's really my goal. And that's also incredibly rewarding. So what are some connections that you can start to make between the things you're naturally interested in and the life you want to live? Another exercise you can try is thinking back to when you were a kid, say 7 or 8 years old. Back then, what is it that you wanted to do more than anything? When I was in first grade, I said I wanted to be a writer. And while content creation isn't just writing per se, writing is a huge element of what I do now, and I love it as an adult. When we're kids, we're completely unimpacted by external pressures. We purely act off our instincts and our natural desires. Society and family pressure can push us in a certain direction as adults, even if that path isn't best for us. The last thing I want you to do is keep an open mind. Get out there and explore some new things. Give things a consistent 2 to 3 month try, and after that period of time, if you're just not that interested, then move on to something else until you find something that you truly enjoy. Be disciplined in your pursuit of that thing over time, and you will slowly develop this passion that we've been talking about. And that's going to lead you to a life that you're very, very proud of. At the end of the day, life is just far too short to spend your time doing something that you don't enjoy. With that said, I'm going to wrap things up how I always do with a quote. Passion is energy. Feel the power that comes from focusing on what excites you. Thanks for listening.